Communication. It's something you've been doing all your life. Ever since you were born, you've been making meaning out of the behavior of others around you, and others have been doing the same to you. You've grown up, made friends, handled fights, told people about who you are and what you need, listened to others about who they are and what they need. If you're listening to this right now, you have survived and built important skills along the way, and that is a glorious thing. And now you're in a college class about the most basic thing you've been doing all your life, communicating. Welcome to ICC Lecture video number 1, by the way. I'm glad you're here. I'm your instructor, Robert Jersak. But why are you here in Intercultural Communication? Well, if you're like most of my students, somebody, maybe an advisor or counselor or program director, probably told you had to take this class. It is a requirement for many programs and technical fields to study. But you know what? I'm so glad you're here, and I think they gave you good advice. And when we look over the course objectives, trust me, these are the skills you're going to be very glad to have. We're going to look at theories and ideas that help you understand who you are as you better seek to understand others across cultural boundaries. You're going to learn new approaches to understanding culture, new frameworks for defining yourself culturally, and new ways to interact and demonstrate interest and respect. There is some very good stuff ahead for us this semester. We'll return to these objectives from time to time to make sure we're all on the right track together and that you're getting your money's worth for the course. And you're going to soon see, if you haven't already, that while everyone can communicate true, not everyone has communication skills. This 2017 NACE study from the publication Job Outlook 2018 makes two things fairly clear. One, employers are looking for people with specific communication skills, and two, today's job seekers aren't as good at these skills as they think they are. If you can communicate well, you have a competitive advantage, and that's what I want all of my students to have. Before we go any further, I'd like to explore this idea of theory because we're just about to examine our first one. Do you know what a theory is? If not, no worries. Let me ask you a simpler question instead. Assuming that there are no clouds to block your sight of it, will the sun rise in the sky tomorrow? Now, it probably will, right? But how do we know this? We can't predict the future, can we? If we could, we'd make a fortune picking lottery numbers and we wouldn't need a college degree at all. No, we think the sun will rise because it's in line with what we've observed before. It fits a familiar pattern, and we use these patterns to make educated guesses about what will happen next. That's the power of theory, to help us make sense of what we've seen before, and also to potentially give us predictive value about what happens next, and that's a big deal. It's not perfect, no theory is, but it can be profoundly helpful in making sense of and navigating our complex world. Here's a theoretical model of communication. It's called the SMCR model. And it's good, right? I mean, it looks a lot like a long pass in U.S. football. But here's the problem with this model. It's just too simple. Communication isn't something I do to other people. I do communication with others. And the process is a lot more complex. To use the football analogy, a lot of interactions have happened before the play occurred, and a lot happened during the play, and a lot happened after the play. And it wasn't just outside interference that could have derailed the catch. It could also have been what was going on in the sender or the receiver's head. And this is the transactional model of communication, and it's better, precisely because it accounts for the depth and dynamic complexity of human communication. Here we can see that people aren't just senders or receivers, they're communicators, constantly sending and receiving messages simultaneously. And that noise is something that occurs within us too, impacting our mental states and our ability to make sense of the messages we receive. For example, if you're streaming a movie while you're trying to talk to someone, that's external noise. But if you're worried about caring for your mother while you're trying to talk to someone, that's internal noise. What's also important here is that the transactional model reminds us that communication is impacted by our environments. You might think of an environment as culture here too. I'm a white, middle-class, U.S. Midwestern college teacher. All of these aspects of my life probably shape the way I'm talking and interacting right now, just as your cultural environments and experiences shape the way you interact. Sometimes this shows up in language or accent differences, and sometimes it shows up in the way we use our body or faces to communicate. People often think of these differences as barriers, and they can be. But I'd also like you to think of them in this class as opportunities for learning more about the world, for finding spaces of common ground, and chances to get out of our own bubbles. There are so many scholarly definitions of communication, but this one's the only one you'll need for this course, the sending and receiving of messages. It's a simple definition, but it's powerfully effective, particularly when we stop to think about what messages really means. Let me put it like this. Everything we do is read by other people. That is to say, people make meaning out of what we do, and we do the same for them. Part of this is so we can build relationships. And part of this is so that we can orient ourselves in a community, and part of this is for our survival, to know how to make sense of what other people are doing and how this might involve us. Simply put, messages equal all human behavior. So let's try to take all human behavior and put it into three main categories. Here's what might make sense. The first category would be verbal messages. Verbal messages are just messages using formal language, essentially words. They can be written or spoken, but using verbal messages is an advanced skill that is taught to us by our cultural groups. The college culture that you're in right now sees this skill as so important, but it requires you to have a series of composition classes where you build your skill in creating and decoding verbal messages in academic and professional contexts. The second type of messages would be paralanguage, paralinguistic cues. All this means is that we use the sound of our voice to make meaning or to impact the meaning of a verbal message. One of the ways we do this is with inflection, giving certain vocal emphasis to certain words so as to impact the meaning. For example, I'm going to give you the same verbal message twice, but I'm going to send it to you with very different meaning in each message. So let's try it. Yes, I love you. Or, yes, I love you. Both verbal messages were exactly the same, but the paralanguage changed the meaning. The first means that you're in good shape with your relational partner, but the second might mean you're in some trouble. Paralanguage can also take the form of non-word sounds, things like pfft or hmm. When I make these sounds, you probably know what they mean, even though you can't look them up in a dictionary. Our third type of messages are nonverbal messages. This category is so huge that we actually have an entire college course devoted to understanding it. The class is called COMM 2033, and it's fascinating. I hope you get a chance to take it. Students get to explore all the aspects of nonverbal communication in more detail and depth. For now, I'll just give you a quick overview by looking at the different types of nonverbal communication. One main type of nonverbal communication is body language, and there are different subtypes of body language. The first would be facial expressions. Now, when you look at these images on a screen, I want you to realize how amazing it is that you can identify these as human faces. I mean, these are just small, simple circles with a few arched lines and dots on them, and yet they have meaning for you. You can even identify emotional expression in them, sadness or pain or surprise or anger or fear, or I'm not quite sure what's going on with the one in the bottom middle of the screen, but I have a pretty good guess. But you get the point. You've been reading and understanding facial expressions since you were born. It's a big part of the way you have survived and built relationships, and it's one of humankind's earliest forms of communication expression. We are social beings, and it makes sense that even when we look at things that are not human in any way, like the moon or a burnt piece of toast, we typically can find a human face if we're looking for it. Facial expressions, interestingly enough, are largely universal across cultures. For example, a smile with raised eyebrows typically means the same kind of welcoming gesture in almost every place in the world. However, cultural rules can govern whether or not these types of expressions are appropriate in certain circumstances. In Southeast Asian cultures, for example, smiling might be discouraged in public contexts because doing so in front of others could communicate to them that you feel you have better fortune than they do, and that could be seen as insulting. Another type of body language would be eye behavior. Eye behavior is a powerful way to send messages to others, and we use it in every face-to-face context. As a teacher, I'm constantly using it to communicate to my students that I'm interested in them and I want to hear more from them. And they're using it with me to communicate whether or not they're interested and ready to talk, or if they wish I wouldn't call on them because they may not be ready to participate. There are many professions in which eye behavior is an important skill to build. In law enforcement, for example, or as a healthcare provider, reading eye behavior might give you clues to someone's condition or something important that they may be choosing not to reveal. In sales, eye behavior is used to establish contact and to build trust and to demonstrate authority. Another type of body language would be hand gestures. Now, if this were a face-to-face class, I would ask you to make a hand gesture and then freeze it. It's always interesting to me to see what students are comfortable in sharing. Often I get two fingers pointed upward in a letter V toward me, and the student means to say peace. Sometimes I have students extend their thumb up toward me, and that means to me that they're happy or that they like what they see. Hand gestures are very useful because they're quick. They can be used at a distance, and they can communicate emotional messages that are harder to express verbally. They have the added benefit of being quickly erasable. This is why military personnel or gang members may use them to flash signs that they only want certain people to see. They also punctuate or reinforce verbal messages as well, providing additional emphasis or support for what's being said, or possibly helping to regulate or moderate the interaction as well. But whereas facial expressions were largely culturally universal, hand gestures are largely culturally specific. In other words, the same gesture used in one place probably doesn't have the same meaning in another. If we were to travel together to Iran, for example, it would be a bad idea for us to begin showing the thumbs up sign, because to those around us the meaning would be vulgar and insulting. As you cross cultural boundaries, it's a good idea to ask before you signal. Another subtype of body language to explore would be posture, stance, and walk. Take a look at these 3 photographs and imagine that there are 3 different applicants for a job. We're on the hiring committee and we have to choose the best applicant. Let's assume that they're similarly qualified. Which one should we hire? Most students tell me the one in the middle, and they say that this person communicates strength, commitment, dependability, and reliability. They're receiving and interpreting messages from his posture. But here's where we need to stop and realize that our interpretation of behavior should be carefully questioned. For example, the other 2 images on the left and the right might be of people who are very dependable and very reliable, but their posture merely reveals a disability that may have come from their life circumstances, their service to the country, or some other condition or heroic act. We can't deny that we receive messages, that we make sense of what we see and hear, but we also need to be willing to question our interpretations and to be interested in having our preconceived ideas about behavior challenged. That willingness to think more deeply and to see a larger picture is such a huge part of learning in this class. Those are just a few of the highlights of nonverbal communication, and there are other forms, of course. Here are a few of them. We observe physical actions, what other people do, to interpret what's happening around us. For example, if you looked out whatever window you're near and saw people running away from the area where you are, you would probably interpret that as you're in a place of danger and you should probably run too. We interpret people's clothing and their appearance as we often try to understand what cultural groups they're a part of, or because of the clothing choices they make. Sometimes they reveal an interest in regional sports teams or local organizations, and other times it can reveal deep religious affiliation. How we use space communicates messages, and I mean this in 2 ways. First, how we use personal space, how close we get to other people or how far we stand from them, communicates important messages to others. Also, how we use environmental space, how we shape the area where we live or we work, communicates messages to others about how welcome they are or something important about our interests and our connections. How we use time communicates messages. For example, if something starts at 7 a.m. and we arrive at 8:15, it may communicate a message that we aren't responsible or that we aren't interested in the appointment. But here again is where culture comes in. In some cultures, if something starts at 7 and you arrive at 7, people may wonder what's wrong with you and may think that perhaps you're very lonely. In other cultures, if you show up at 7, those who are there 15 minutes early may wonder why you're cutting the time so close. We're going to explore this more closely in our first book by Craig Storty, and you'll see this in one of the building blocks of culture scales, concept of time. We communicate nonverbally through touch. Having lived in the Midwest all my life, I can tell you that my travels have revealed to me that the Midwest in the U.S. is typically a low-touch culture. I've been to other places where handshakes and hugs, pats on the back are far more common than they are here. What kind of touch is okay, for example, whether or not it's appropriate to touch someone on the shoulders or above, really varies from culture to culture, and it's very important to observe behavior in other cultures before engaging in touch. This research here, conducted in the 1970s by Albert Moravian, has been hard to replicate, but its findings generally hold true. From this, we realize that the total meaning of an interaction with another largely comes from our nonverbal communication and our paralanguage, and relatively little comes from the actual meaning of the words we say. You can imagine that if I recorded these lectures in a very monotone voice, that could impact their meaning and also your level of engagement. Another way to think about the importance of this is in a job interview. Almost everyone is going to say the same things in an interview, that they're qualified, they're interested, they want to work there. How you're going to get that job will come from the way you use your voice and your body to communicate your enthusiasm, your intelligence, and your ability. I highly encourage you to practice before job interviews, and please let me know if you need help or guidance in finding support at the college. We have a career development center designed to help you find the job you're looking for. Wait, can I go back just a second? Even though the linear SMCR model is outdated, it's important to talk a little bit about channel. Channel is the medium across which the messages travel. And this can happen through face-to-face interaction, but also through mediated channels like texting, social media, broadcasting channels, and more. If you were to study communication even more deeply, you'd realize that the channel actually impacts the meaning of the message as well. Just to give you an example, imagine you need to end a relationship. So you think it's just the right thing to say. Hey, it's not you, it's me. I think we're going to be much happier apart than together, something like that. Now you have a decision to make. You could write this in a letter, or you could meet this person face to face and say it, or you could record yourself and post it to that person's Facebook page. It may be the same verbal message in all three cases, but it's the channel that you chose that carries much of the meaning and importance to the other person. In this class, we'll be talking predominantly about face-to-face channels across cultural boundaries, but we should also keep in mind the importance of social media connections that we make across cultural boundaries as well. A big learning takeaway at this point is that you cannot not communicate. All of us are essentially like broadcast towers, constantly sending out signals to others through our behavior. Even in this photograph, the child who cannot yet speak communicates something about gender, about health or well-being, about emotion, even about environment. This is my daughter when she was very young, and we dressed her in blue because baby clothes are expensive, and when people give you hand-me-downs, you should take them. It's normal to feel a bit self-conscious at this stage because many of the messages that you're sending to others you may not have been aware of before, and that's completely okay. It's good to start thinking about the many ways we send signals to others and read signals from others. That's a huge part of intercultural communication skill. Another big takeaway at this point is that culture impacts our messages. It impacts the way we send them, as well as the way we receive and understand them. And because of this, we need to start building the critical skill of observing and describing behavior and trying to step back from interpreting it or evaluating it. When you cross a cultural boundary, or when someone crosses into yours, behavior isn't always going to mean what you think it means. So it's very important to be able to stop first and think about what you're seeing and try to describe it in simple terms as possible. This helps us ask questions and see behavior from multiple perspectives. I'd like you to take a little time this week to go over the observation and interpretation section in Understanding World's Cultures. If you have the older edition, Figuring Foreigners Out, then look for the section towards the end of the book called Description or Interpretation. Review this section and complete the exercise. It's going to tie perfectly into the brief activity I'm about to explain on the following slides. Now, when we witness an image or an event, when we notice behavior across cultural barriers, there are really three main ways that we can talk about it or share it. We can evaluate it, explaining how we feel about what we see and what we think is happening. Or we can interpret it, just explaining what we think is happening. But I'm going to push us to describe our observations, to talk very simply and more objectively about what we see. This activity is called the DIE activity, and it was popularized by Century College's own John Wendt as a part of his work with the University of Minnesota. And this slide, I think, is a perfect way to start. It's the fall of 2018, the second year of the Donald Trump presidency in the United States. As you look at this picture, you may have any number of positive or negative reactions. And I want you to know that beyond any evaluations of right or wrong, all of your reactions are completely understandable. Our personal and cultural experiences shape us to see and to understand things in profoundly different ways sometimes. So however you feel about what you see here, I want you to know that I understand and that it makes sense. However, if we all want to have some kind of more widely shared understanding about what we see here, we have to step away from our evaluations and also our interpretations. Perhaps we can all agree that what we're seeing in this photograph is an adult male human being holding two infant children. There are other human beings surrounding this person. Some are smiling and looking over the shoulder of the man. The man's mouth is open, his eyebrows are arched upward. The child in his left arm has closed eyes and sharply downturned eyebrows, and an arm which is perhaps trying to wriggle free. The child in his right arm is looking outside of the image, reaching a right arm towards something or someone else. There are adult human beings in suits in front of this man, and one of them appears to have a communication device or wire coming from his ear down to the back of his neck. That's descriptive language, trying as best we can to share in what we see and understand. If we were to interpret this image further, we might say that this is a campaign rally, and that these children are either pleased or not pleased to be part of the photo opportunity. I'm going to leave the evaluations of how you feel about what you see here entirely up to you. And this is a worthwhile exercise with so many of the images that we see or are sent to us. For some of you, this image, for example, has considerable meaning and comes attached with strong emotions. For others of you, you have no frame or reference for understanding this image, or knowing why it would have been popular in Minnesota in January of 2018. So I'm going to try this activity with another image. I'm not going to show you the image yet. I'm just going to paint this image in your mind before you see it. And I'm going to try and explain why descriptive language is so much more helpful in sharing this image. Are you ready? Let's try it. Okay, if I were to evaluate what's in this image, I would say that I have an image of something really bad. It's awful. It's unethical. I think it's just wrong. Now we have a real problem, don't we? Because what's wrong to me may not be wrong to you, and what I think is terrible may not be what you think is terrible. So we can't really use evaluation as a way of talking about this image, can we? Let me try again. If I were to interpret this image, I would say what we have here is a scene of prostitution, a person selling their body for money. Now some of you may be wondering how explicit this image is, and trust me, all of your images in your minds are still different from each other, probably in vastly different ways. But also, you know what? I might be wrong about what I think I see, and my interpretation may actually be damaging your ability to understand what's happening. So let me try a description. What I'm going to show you in a moment is not actually a photograph, but instead a work of visual art that looks like it's done with pastels or chalk. However, we can see recognizable forms in it. So on the right-hand side of the screen is going to be an automobile pulled up to the curb. You're only going to see the front of the automobile facing you. You're going to be able to see through the windshield. You're going to see the right side of the car. Inside the car is what appears to be a man. He's wearing a black necktie and he's looking down into his lap. The corners of his mouth are turned down and his brow is furrowed. On the left-hand side of the picture is what appears to be a woman. She has blonde hair that goes down just past her shoulders. She appears to have on black high-heel shoes and a skirt that ends just above her knee. She is leaning in towards the man in the vehicle, though she's not looking at him. She's looking up and above the top of the vehicle. And behind the two of them is just a wash of different shapes and colors that remind me of a city scene in the background. Here's the actual image. Now, which of the three types of talking about this image was most helpful in sharing it, in painting it in your mind? Description, interpretation, or evaluation? While my description certainly wasn't perfect, it probably was the best in helping you see the same thing together. Because values differ by culture, evaluation is hard to share, and my interpretation, as I noted, may have been completely wrong. As we look at the following images that I've used in face-to-face classes before for this activity, I want you to think about what you see. I'd like you to try this activity with someone around you. Please call them into the room, pause the video on one of the images, and try to describe what you see. Try to paint the picture in their mind. And then later you can show it to them. You may or may not be able to interpret the image accurately, but it's helpful just to practice describing. Now, why does this activity matter? Let's stop and take a look at this image. I used this one in class several years ago, and I remember overhearing a student describe it to his partner as a riot. He said, "These men are out to create some trouble." The student was going into law enforcement, and I understood his need to be actively looking for areas of danger and concern. However, I asked him and the rest of the class to look closely and carefully. Look at the facial expressions of the men. Do they look concerned and angry, or do they look surprised and excited? Look at the use of their hands. Do we see clenched fists that appear ready for violence, or do we see gestures that seem open and celebratory? As it turns out, these Liberian men were celebrating a football victory over the Ivory Coast. It's very important to be able to question our interpretations in our evaluations, because in some cases, for those who are in very difficult job circumstances, our ability to more accurately read messages may be a matter of life and death. We have to also understand the truth in this translated Chinese proverb, that we often just see what's behind our eyes, not what's in front of it. In other words, our perception is something that reflects what we expect to see, rather than what we're actually seeing. This is something we'll return to throughout the semester, particularly as we look at intercultural sensitivity and bias later on. And that is all I have for you this week. Thank you so much for joining me for this first ICC Lecture video. I'm excited to continue the learning with you in the weeks and videos to come. If you have any questions about the ideas or the concepts raised in this video, please do post them to our discussion board, or you can send me an email if you prefer. Your learning in this class is always very important to me. Until next time.